Okay, so last time we looked at racial constructionism. This time we're going to shift gears away from talking about race in reference to talking about gender in reference. And here's some basic positions on gender in reference. First, I should say here's some basic positions on the metaphysics of sex, and then we're going to think about reference when assessing these positions. So the first position is that sex is a biological category defined by one's role in reproduction. Male and female are the sexes, and there is a hidden structure for each sex, and sex equals gender. I don't know why it says and there twice, but here's the basic idea. Sex is a biological category. There's a male and there's a female category. There's a hidden structure for each. The hidden structure is related to your role in reproduction. And gender and sex are just the same thing. There's no distinction. So this is an older position that was pretty common many years ago. Under pressure from both overwhelming evidence and theorizing about that evidence, we sort of abandoned view one and shifted to view two, that sex is a biological category defined by one's role in reproduction. Male and female are the two sexes, but there's no hidden structure for the sexes because that which determines your role in reproduction doesn't have further implications. It doesn't tell you anything especially interesting about your psychology or your behavior. The idea is that apparent psychological characteristics that are distinctive of women and apparent psychological, or let me put it slightly differently, psychological characteristics that are apparently distinctive of women and psychological characteristics that are apparently distinctive of men, and the same for behavioral characteristics, are not caused by the same thing that causes you to play the role in reproduction that you do, not grounded in the same thing that grounds your role in reproduction, but instead are caused by or grounded in social features. I should say caused by social facts. And on this view, we can preserve the idea that sex and gender are the same thing. We're not talking about them using those terms differently yet. Next, sex is a biological category defined by one's role in reproduction. Male and female are the sexes, so far the same. There's no hidden structure for the sexes, so far the same as three. But here comes the difference. Gender is not the same thing as sex, and gender is socially constructed. So the idea here is that sex is a biological category and gender is a social category. Now, I say see Alex Byrne for an expression of this view. If you look at the linked file, there's a pretty simple and articulate defense of this view. This view was a traditional feminist view. So a traditional feminist view said, look, yes, there are sexes. There's male and female, maybe some intersex people, but by and large, you can divide the human population into the male and the female. And where we use those terms as terms for the distinct sexes, those sexes are marked by the role that someone plays in reproduction. That is, they're defined by the role that someone plays in reproduction. But the role you play in reproduction really isn't predictive of anything else about you. It's not going to tell us anything about the odds that you have a certain IQ or the odds that you have a certain tendency to be empathetic or whatever. It's just your role in reproduction. Gender is what's tracking things like whether you're empathetic or not, maybe, and gender is socially constructed. Okay, so again, this is a traditional feminist view. In recent years, it's come under attack and to some extent been supplanted, although there's still back and forth on this, with the view that gender and sex are the same thing and gender is socially constructed. So then it follows, of course, that sex is socially constructed. So the idea here is that neither sex nor gender are biological categories. Neither is defined by one's role in reproduction. Instead, both are determined by social factors. They're just social categories. Okay. I want you to notice that 3 and 4 both leave open how gender is socially constructed. So both 3 and 4 agree that gender is socially constructed. Neither says anything about how that happens. So here's a question. How does it happen, according to one or another theory? Well, here's Haslinger's view. Haslinger says, we're going to choose the meaning of our gender terms just as we choose the meaning of our race terms. So she doesn't think we should look to antecedent usage. We shouldn't go out and figure out what people's intuitions about how gender terms apply to cases is. She doesn't think we should go out and look at how people actually use the terms. Instead, we should just stipulate, here's what we mean when we use the terms like man and woman, and we choose what to mean based on what's most politically useful. So here's Haslinger's view. A subject S functions as a woman in context C if and only if, by definition, S is observed or imagined in C to have certain bodily features presumed to be evidence of females' biological role in reproduction. Notice that this parallels her view about being racialized. There we said that someone is observed or imagined to have certain bodily features that are indicative of their ancestry. Here we're saying they're observed or imagined to have certain bodily features that are indicative of their role in reproduction. That S has those features marks S within the context of the background ideology in that context as someone who should occupy certain kinds of social positions that are in fact subordinate. And the fact that S satisfies those conditions plays or would play a role in their systematic subordination in that context along some particular dimension. And S's social position in that context is oppressive. And S satisfying those conditions plays a role in that dimension of subordination. So here's the basic idea in sum. Someone counts as, let's just say, someone counts as a woman. If, that is the term woman applies to them correctly, if, because they appear to have certain characteristics that are indicative of a certain role in reproduction, we take them to have further features that justify them occupying subordinate social positions. That's the basic idea. Okay? And remember, this is supposed to be a stipulative definition. So a few things to notice about this definition. First, if you take this definition on board, you can combine it with 3 or 4. So you can combine it with the view that sex and gender are the same thing, or the view that they're distinct. If you combine it with 3, you'll say, this is my definition of gender, but sex is something else. Maybe it's that biological thing. If you combine it with 4, you'll say, this definition of gender is also my definition of sex. Second, Haslinger's definition makes whether or not someone is a woman depend on whether or not others judge that person to be a woman. And the reason I'm emphasizing it makes whether or not someone is a woman count as whether or not others judge her to be a woman is because that result counters a contemporary view on which self-identification determines gender. Now, Haslinger wrote this paper before that contemporary view became an especially popular view. But according to this especially popular view, that is a view that's especially popular these days, what gender you are is determined entirely by what gender you identify yourself as. Now, this can be combined with 3, and we can say what gender you are is determined by what gender you identify yourself as, but what sex you are is fixed by your role in reproduction or certain facts about what role in reproduction you would have if certain other conditions held. Or we can combine this with 4 and say not only is your gender determined by how you identify, but your sex is too. Third, I want you to notice that one who accepts 3 could say, this is what I just said, could say that self-identification determines gender but not sex, but one who accepts 4 can't say that. They have to say that self-identification determines both. Now, if you accept 4, that gender and sex are the same thing, and that they're both socially constructed, and you accept that self-identification is how they're constructed, then you'd be hard-pressed to say that biological facts should play a role in dividing people by gender for any purpose at all, including, for example, professional sports. So if what it is to be a woman at the end of the day, in terms of both sex and gender, is to identify as a woman, then when you want to divide people into men and women for, say, the purpose of sporting, you'd have to say, if you adopt a self-identification standard, then someone who self-identifies as a woman would play in the women's sports, and someone who self-identifies as a man would play in the men's sports. Again, if you accept any of 1 to 3, you can say that there are contexts where dividing people by sex or gender based on biological facts may make sense, and sports may be one of them. But if you accept 4 and you accept self-identification as the standard for how sexes get constructed, how sexes/genders get constructed, you can't say that. And I'm bringing this up because this has been a hot issue over the last few years, whether self-identification is sufficient for being a woman in the sense of both gender and sex, and if it is, then what the social consequences might be. And this is something you can think about. It's an interesting question. It's something I think merits more careful thought than it's been given, in part because it's a kind of hot button issue, so people get upset when others' views contradict their own. Okay, we're going to continue next time with a brief discussion of a paper by Rebecca Tuvel, which takes some of these controversial issues head on.